The red dust of Kosoto rose like ancestral spirits against the amber sky as Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of what would become humanity's greatest experiment. Behind him, the sprawling compounds of his childhood stretched endlessly, tin roofs catching the last light, children's laughter echoing from narrow alleys, the eternal rhythm of women pounding millet in wooden mortars. Before him lay 10,000 hectares of sacred land, where his grandmother once told him the spirits of their ancestors danced beneath the baobab trees. "Baba, you see this?" His voice carried the weight of generations as he spoke to the photograph tucked inside his dashiki pocket. His father's weathered face, eyes bright with dreams that colonialism had crushed. $500 billion. Not from the World Bank, not from Paris or London or Washington. From us. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of shea butter and wood smoke from the village, mingling with the metallic tang of surveying equipment and the sharp smell of freshly printed blueprints. Ibrahim's fingers traced the outline of the master plan spread across the hood of his Land Cruiser, each line representing a promise to 50 million Africans, from Lagos to Nairobi, from Cairo to Cape Town, who had invested their savings, their hopes, their very souls into this vision. "Nana," he whispered to the baobab tree that had stood sentinel for 3 centuries, its massive trunk scarred by time and weather but still reaching toward the sky with defiant grace. "Nana, forgive me if I disturb your rest. But we must build the future on the bones of the past." The tree's leaves rustled in response, and Kwame felt the familiar presence of his grandmother's spirit. Nana, yeah, the storyteller who had filled his childhood with tales of kingdoms that sparkled like stars, of technologies that sang with the voices of their makers, of a time when African minds shaped the world instead of merely surviving in it. "Ibrahim," came a voice from behind him, rich with the musical cadence of Wolof mixed with French colonial undertones. "Mon frère, you stand there like a man about to part the Red Sea." Ibrahim turned to find Aminata Diallo approaching, her steps deliberate and graceful despite the uneven terrain. She wore her heritage like armor, intricate braids adorned with gold threads that caught the dying light, a flowing bubu that moved like water, and eyes that held the fire of 1,000 rebellions. As his chief technology officer and closest confidant, she was the bridge between his vision and the digital realm that would make it reality. "Aminatawa," he replied, the greeting carrying the warmth of their shared childhood in Ouagadougou, when they had built imaginary cities from mud and dreams. "I was just asking the ancestors for their blessing." She joined him at the Land Cruiser, her engineer's eye scanning the blueprints with the precision of a master weaver examining her loom. "And what did they say?" "They said the same thing they always say, remember who you are and where you come from." The master plan spread before them was more than architecture. It was a manifesto written in steel and silicon, glass and determination. The Central District would house the quantum computing centers, their servers cooled by groundwater and powered by the largest solar array in West Africa. Surrounding it, residential towers would rise like modern baobabs, their facades incorporating traditional patterns from across the continent. Ndebele geometric designs, Kent-weaving motifs, Hausa architectural elements that would make each building a celebration of African aesthetics. "The investors arrive tomorrow," Aminata said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone they had used as children when planning raids on the mango trees. "Johannesburg, Lagos, Accra, Dakar, Nairobi. They're calling it the African Investment Summit of the century." Ibrahim nodded, his mind already shifting to the delicate dance of diplomacy and determination that lay ahead. $500 billion raised from African sources alone. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, diaspora investments, and the collective savings of millions who had bought into the dream of an African Silicon Valley. No colonial strings attached, no structural adjustment programs, no conditions that would compromise their vision. "And the others?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Chinese are circling like vultures. Beijing Development Bank is offering $600 billion, but you know what comes with that money." Her voice carried the bitter taste of experience. "The French are making noises about technical assistance and cultural preservation. The Americans sent 3 different delegations last week, all with their own versions of partnership opportunities." Ibrahim's jaw tightened. He had spent 15 years in Silicon Valley, earning his fortune in the digital gold rush while watching his homeland's brightest minds drain away to foreign shores. He had returned with more than money, he had returned with the knowledge of how the global technology game was played, and the determination to change its rules. "Kuma fo ka kuma," he said, the Bambara proverb rolling off his tongue like a prayer. Word for word, "We build this ourselves or we don't build it at all." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. A convoy of black SUVs wound through the village, their tinted windows reflecting the burning sky. Kwame recognized the license plates, diplomatic corps, probably another delegation coming to offer assistance with strings attached like chains. "Patron," called out Seydou, his head of security, jogging up the hill with the fluid grace of a man who had learned his trade in the French Foreign Legion before returning home to protect African interests. "The German delegation is here." Early. Kwame exchanged a look with Aminata. The Germans had been the most persistent, offering everything from technical expertise to raw materials, but always with the underlying assumption that African vision needed European guidance. "Tell them we'll meet at the compound in an hour," Kwame said. "And Seydou, make sure they understand this is our land, our project, our rules." The young man's smile was sharp as a razor. "With pleasure, patron." As the convoy disappeared down the hill, Kwame felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The red dust beneath his feet had been walked by warriors and kings, by slaves and freedom fighters, by his own grandfather who had fought against the French colonial machine with nothing but courage and conviction. Now it was his turn to fight, not with weapons but with technology, not against armies but against the assumption that Africa would forever remain a consumer rather than a creator of the future. "Nana," he whispered again to the baobab tree, "tonight we tell the story of our tomorrow." The compound that evening buzzed with the energy of a war council. Solar panels painted the courtyard in geometric shadows as delegates from across the continent gathered under strings of LED lights that pulsed in rhythm with traditional drums. This was Kwame's masterstroke. Every meeting, every negotiation, every decision would be made on African soil in African spaces, according to African protocols. Dr. Fatima al-Rashid from Cairo arrived first, her hijab adorned with patterns that echoed the pharaonic columns of her homeland, her tablet displaying economic models that would make the World Bank economists weep with envy. She had single-handedly restructured Egypt's sovereign wealth fund to support the project, turning petroleum profits into digital dividends. "Kwame Habibi," she called out in her musical Arabic-accented English, "I brought the numbers you requested. The quantum fiber optic network alone will generate enough revenue to fund education for the entire Sahel region." Behind her came Dr. Johannesburg Nthembu, South Africa's tech mogul whose mining fortune had been transformed into the continent's largest venture capital fund. His traditional Zulu beadwork seemed to shimmer against his modern suit, each pattern telling the story of a people who had survived apartheid to build economic empires. "Sabobona, Budi," he greeted Kwame with the warmth of brotherhood. "The Johannesburg Exchange has cleared the infrastructure bonds. We're ready to make history." One by one they arrived. The validators, the dreamers, the economic warriors who had chosen to bet on African excellence rather than foreign dependency. From Lagos came Aduni Okafor, whose tech empire had emerged from the chaos of Nigerian oil wealth. From Nairobi, Dr. Wanjiku Mwangi, whose agricultural technology had revolutionized farming from Kenya to Ethiopia. From Accra, Kwame Nkrumah Jr., whose name carried the weight of Pan-African dreams and whose fintech innovations had connected African markets like never before. But it was the arrival of Mzee Jomo Kenyatta III that silenced the courtyard. The elderly statesman moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had witnessed independence struggles and survived the betrayals that followed. His walking stick was carved from indigenous African wood, its handle shaped like a fist raised in eternal defiance. "Watoto wangu," he said, his voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom, "My children, I have lived through the false promises of the colonial masters and the bitter disappointments of neo-colonial partnerships. Tonight, I want to hear why this dream will not become another beautiful failure." The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with the ghosts of abandoned development projects and broken promises. Kwame felt the weight of every failed initiative, every drained brain, every resource extracted and never returned. But he also felt the strength of the ancestors flowing through him, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived slavery, colonialism, and the subtle vampirism of modern economic imperialism. "Mzee," he began, his voice gathering the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. "Mzee, let me tell you a story that our grandmothers told us, about the spider who thought he could weave with the white man's silk, only to discover that the web was not his own." The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sound of drums and the whisper of the evening breeze through the baobab leaves. "For 50 years we have been the spider trying to weave with foreign silk. We send our children to Harvard and Oxford, and they return speaking languages that do not carry the wisdom of our ancestors. We invite foreign investment, and it arrives with conditions that turn our sovereignty into suggestions. We build with their money, and discover that the blueprints were drawn in boardrooms where our voices are not heard. He paused, letting the truth of his words settle like dust on the evening air. But tonight, tonight we choose to weave with our own silk. $500 billion raised from African sources. Technology centers designed by African architects. Systems programmed by African engineers. A digital infrastructure that connects Dakar to Dar es Salaam, Lagos to Lusaka, without routing through London or New York or Beijing. Dr. Al-Rashid leaned forward, her economist's mind already calculating the implications. The quantum computing centers will process African data on African servers. Our agricultural information, our mineral surveys, our genetic research, all of it stays on the continent. More than that, added Aminata, her tablet displaying architectural renderings that seem to glow with their own inner light. The smart city will be a living laboratory. Every innovation, every patent, every technological breakthrough will be owned by African institutions. We're not just building a city. We're building an ecosystem of innovation that will spread across the continent like wildfire. Mzee Kenyatta's eyes gleamed with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of the LED lights. And if the foreigners come with their offers of partnership? Ibrahim's smile was sharp as a warrior's spear. Then we remind them that this is a sovereign African project. They are welcome to invest, welcome to participate, but they are not welcome to control. The decision-making power remains with African institutions, the intellectual property remains with African inventors, and the profits remain on African soil. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Around the courtyard, the delegates began to nod, their faces reflecting the dawning realization that they were not just witnessing history, they were about to make it. Dr. Mthembu was the first to speak, his voice carrying the rolling cadence of the Zulu Hills. The mining sector alone will generate enough revenue to fund the entire first phase. But what about the skeptics? The ones who say we don't have the technical expertise, the institutional capacity, the political stability? Then we prove them wrong, said Adunni Okafor, her Lagos accent sharp with determination. I built my first tech company in a garage in Yaba during the military dictatorship. If Nigerian entrepreneurs can thrive in chaos, African engineers can certainly build in peace. The conversation flowed like a river gathering strength, each voice adding to the current of possibility. They discussed quantum encryption protocols designed specifically for African communication needs, agricultural drones that could revolutionize farming from the Sahel to the Kalahari, medical AI systems trained on African genetic data and traditional healing knowledge. But it was Dr. Wanjiku Mwangi who voiced the question that haunted them all. And what happens when the established powers realize that we're not just building a smart city, we're building a new economic order? The courtyard fell silent again, but this time the silence was electric with anticipation rather than heavy with doubt. They all knew the answer and had lived through the consequences of African success that threatened global power structures. From Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara, from Kwame Nkrumah to Steve Biko, African leaders who had dared to dream of true independence had faced the full weight of international pressure. Then we remember, Ibrahim said softly, that we are not alone. He gestured to the circle of faces around him, Egyptian, Nigerian, Kenyan, South African, Ghanaian, Senegalese, each representing millions of Africans who had chosen to believe in African solutions to African challenges. We remember that we are 1.4 billion people with the youngest population in the world, sitting on 60% of the world's mineral resources, with renewable energy potential that could power half the globe. We remember that every smartphone in Silicon Valley contains coltan from the Congo, every solar panel in Germany contains silicon from Nigeria, every electric car battery in China contains lithium from Zimbabwe. His voice gathered strength like a river approaching the sea. And we remember that the time has come to add value to our resources instead of exporting them raw. The time has come to process our own data instead of sending it to foreign servers. The time has come to solve our own problems instead of waiting for foreign solutions. The drums in the distance seemed to grow louder, their rhythm matching the pulse of hearts that had decided to beat in unison. Around the courtyard, the delegates began to understand that they were not just investors in a construction project. They were midwives to a new birth, witnesses to the moment when African potential transformed into African reality. Asante Sana Mzee, whispered Dr. Kenyatta, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime's dreams and disappointments. Asante Sana for reminding us that we are not beggars at the table of global development. We are the inheritors of the kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, the builders of the pyramids and Great Zimbabwe, the inventors of mathematics and astronomy and medicine. The evening deepened around them, but the courtyard seemed to glow with its own inner light. Solar panels captured the last rays of the sun and transformed them into energy that would power African dreams. LED lights pulsed in patterns that echoed traditional textiles, technology and tradition woven together like threads in a master weaver's loom. "Tomorrow," said Ibrahim, "we break ground. But tonight, we break the chains of dependency that have bound us for 5 centuries. Tonight, we reclaim our place as builders of the future instead of victims of the past." The drums rolled like thunder across the hills, and in that sound the delegates heard the voice of their ancestors, not mourning the past but celebrating the future, not cursing the darkness but lighting the way forward. Dawn broke over Kasoto like a prayer answered, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless the earth below. The village stirred with the rhythms of daily life, women balancing water jugs on their heads, children racing through narrow alleys, the eternal sound of mortars and pestles preparing the morning meal. But today was different. Today the air hummed with the electricity of transformation. Ibrahim Traoré stood once again beside the ancient baobab, but now he was not alone. The tree's massive shadow sheltered a gathering that would have been impossible just months before. African engineers and architects, quantum physicists and agricultural scientists, urban planners and environmental specialists, all united by the conviction that their continent's future lay in their own hands. "Nana," he whispered to the tree, "today we plant the seed of tomorrow." The ceremony began with the traditional protocols that had governed important decisions for 1,000 years. Griot Mamadou Kouyate, the master storyteller whose family had preserved the oral histories of the Mande people for 20 generations, stepped forward with his kora, its strings gleaming in the morning light. "Ayaiwa," he began, his voice carrying the musical cadence of the Mandinka praise singers. "Ayaiwa, listen well, for today we sing the song of the future, but first we must remember the song of the past." The chorus strings vibrated with harmonies that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, melodies that had accompanied the rise and fall of empires, the arrival and departure of colonizers, the struggles and triumphs of generations who had refused to surrender their dreams. "Once there was a time," the griot sang, "when the cities of Timbuktu and Gao were centers of learning that drew students from across the world. When the universities of Sankore possessed libraries that held the wisdom of the ages. When African gold financed the Renaissance in Europe, and African knowledge lit the lamps of civilization." The audience swayed gently to the rhythm, their faces reflecting the pride and pain of a history that had been systematically erased from global memory. But today that history was not a burden to be carried, it was a foundation to be built upon. Then came the ships with their human cargo, the griot continued, his voice deepening with sorrow. Then came the colonizers with their maps and their flags, drawing lines across the land that divided families and scattered nations. Then came the independence that was not independence, the aid that was not aid, the partnerships that were not partnerships. The chorus strings trembled with emotions too deep for words, but the griot's voice grew stronger, lifting above the sorrow toward something that glowed with possibility. "But the tree remembers," he sang, gesturing toward the baobab whose branches seemed to embrace the entire gathering. "The tree remembers that its roots run deep, that its trunk grows strong, that its branches reach toward the sky with ancient determination. And today we plant new seeds in the shade of ancient wisdom." The applause that followed was not the polite clapping of corporate ceremonies but the full-throated appreciation of people who had been reminded of their own greatness. Kwame felt the power of the moment flowing through him, connecting him to the millions of Africans who had dreamed of this day without knowing they were dreaming. Dr. Amina Cohn, the quantum physicist who had left CERN to join the project, stepped forward with a small device that looked like a crystalline sculpture. "This is the quantum processor prototype," she said, her voice carrying the excitement of discovery. "Designed specifically for African communication needs, powered by African solar arrays, cooled by African groundwater, and programmed by African engineers." She placed the device in a specially prepared hollow at the base of the baobab tree, its surfaces reflecting the morning light like captured stars. "This tree has watched over this land for 3 centuries. Now it will watch over the birth of African technological sovereignty." The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. The ancient and the modern, the traditional and the technological, the wisdom of the ancestors and the dreams of the children, all connected by the unbroken thread of African determination. Construction began immediately after the ceremony, but this was not the violent disruption that usually accompanied development projects. Kwame had insisted on what he called surgical construction, techniques that worked with the natural landscape rather than against it, that incorporated existing ecosystems rather than destroying them, that honored sacred sites rather than bulldozing them. The first structures to rise were the data centers, their servers humming with the quiet efficiency of systems designed for African conditions. Solar panels created geometric patterns across the landscape, their surfaces angled to capture the maximum energy from the equatorial sun. Wind turbines spun lazily in the morning breeze, their blades designed to minimize noise and maximize harmony with the natural environment. But it was the residential areas that truly showcased the project's revolutionary approach. Instead of the cookie-cutter apartment blocks that had blighted African cities for decades, these buildings rose like organic sculptures, their facades incorporating traditional patterns from across the continent. Yoruba geometric designs flowed into Hausa architectural elements, Ndebele patterns merged with Kent motifs, creating a visual symphony that celebrated African aesthetics while embracing African functionality. Ibrahimwa, called Aminata from the construction site, her voice carrying over the controlled chaos of heavy machinery and human activity. The fiber optic network is ahead of schedule. We'll have continental connectivity within 6 months. Ibrahim Traoré nodded, but his attention was caught by a different sight. Children from the village gathering at the fence, their faces pressed against the chain link as they watched the future taking shape before their eyes. He recognized some of them from his own childhood, but these were their younger brothers and sisters, their nieces and nephews, their own children who would grow up in a world where African technological leadership was not a dream but a reality. "Papa," called out a young girl with braids adorned with colorful beads, "Papa, will we be able to live in the beautiful houses?" The question stopped him cold. In all his planning, all his preparation, he had focused on the global implications of the project. The economic sovereignty, the technological independence, the geopolitical ramifications. But he had not fully considered the most important question. Would this transformation benefit the people who had been here first, or would it displace them like so many development projects before? "Awa," he said, kneeling to bring himself to her eye level, "what is your name?" "Fatumata," she replied, her voice carrying the musical cadence of the fooled people. "My grandmother says you are building a city for your ancestors." "Your grandmother is wise," he said, his voice gentle with respect. "But I am building a city for the living. For you and your children and your children's children. Will you help me?" The girl's eyes widened with excitement. "What can I do? I'm only 9 years old." "You can learn," he said, his voice carrying the weight of promise. "You can study mathematics, science and engineering. You can grow up to be one of the builders instead of one of the watchers. You can help us prove that African children can create technologies that the whole world needs." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another convoy, this one flying the flags of several European nations. Kwame's security chief, Seydou, jogged up with the controlled urgency of someone who had learned to read political weather patterns. "Patron," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "the German development minister, the French trade attaché, and the British investment consortium. They're requesting an immediate meeting about mutual opportunities for collaboration." Kwame stood slowly, his mind already shifting to the delicate diplomatic dance that lay ahead. The foreign interest was predictable. No major African development project could proceed without attracting the attention of former colonial powers who still viewed the continent as their exclusive sphere of influence. "Tell them we'll meet this afternoon," he said. "And Seydou, make sure they understand that they are guests in our house, not partners in our project." The young man's smile was sharp with understanding. "Of course, patron. African protocols, African terms." As the convoy wound its way toward the government compound, Ibrahim Traoré felt the familiar weight of history settling on his shoulders. Every African leader who had dared to dream of true independence had faced this moment, the point at which foreign interests began to exert pressure, offering carrots and sticks in equal measure to ensure that African resources continued to flow toward European and American prosperity. But this time was different. This time, the project was fully funded by African sources, designed by African engineers and controlled by African institutions. This time, the foreigners would have to accept African terms or find themselves excluded from the greatest technological revolution in human history. "Aminata," he called out, "prepare the presentation for this afternoon. I want them to understand exactly what we're building here." She nodded, her tablet already displaying the economic models that would make foreign economists weep with envy. "The quantum computing centers alone will generate more revenue than most African countries' entire GDP. Agricultural technology will revolutionize farming from the Sahel to the Kalahari. The medical research facilities will develop treatments for diseases that affect millions of Africans but attract no foreign investment because the patients are too poor to pay." "And the intellectual property?" Every patent, every innovation, every breakthrough will be owned by African institutions. We're not just building a smart city, we're building a knowledge economy that will make Africa the technological leader of the 21st century. The afternoon sun was merciless as the foreign delegations arrived at the compound, their European suits wilting in the heat that Kwame and his team wore like a comfortable blanket. The symbolism was not accidental. Every meeting, every negotiation, every decision would be made in the African climate, on African soil, according to African protocols. Minister Klaus Richter from Germany arrived first, his face already flushed with heat and what might have been irritation. Behind him came François Dubois, the French trade attaché whose family had grown wealthy on African resources for 3 generations. Last came Sir Reginald Pemberton, whose British investment consortium had been developing African resources since the colonial era. Messrs. Kwame greeted them in perfect French, his tone carrying the courtesy of hospitality without the deference of dependency. Welcome to our project. Please, sit in the shade. The African sun can be unforgiving to those who are not accustomed to its embrace. The subtlety was lost on none of them. This was not a boardroom in London or Paris or Berlin where European languages and European protocols dominated the conversation. This was Africa, and they were guests who would be treated with respect but not with subservience. Mr. Traoré, began Minister Richter, his English carrying the precision of German engineering, we have reviewed your project specifications with great interest. Germany is prepared to offer technical assistance, engineering expertise, and financial support that could significantly accelerate your timeline. Monsieur le Ministre, Kwame replied, switching to French with the fluency of someone who had mastered the colonizers' language without being mastered by it, I appreciate your interest. But perhaps you could explain why Africa needs German assistance to build African cities with African resources for African people. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Kwame could see the delegates struggling to formulate a response that would not sound overtly neo-colonial. They had grown accustomed to African leaders who begged for foreign investment, who accepted foreign conditions, who treated European interest as validation of their own worth. Mr. Traoré, interjected Sir Reginald, his Oxford accent carrying the weight of centuries of assumed superiority, surely you understand that a project of this magnitude requires international expertise, global supply chains, and established financial instruments. No single region, however ambitious, can hope to develop such complex technologies in isolation. Kwame's smile was sharp as a warrior's spear. Sir Reginald, I appreciate your concern for our capabilities. But perhaps you could explain why British mining companies have been extracting African resources for over a century without developing any meaningful African capacity, while African engineers in my project have developed quantum computing systems that surpass anything currently available in London. The delegations exchanged glances, and Kwame could see them beginning to understand that this was not a traditional development negotiation where African leaders accepted foreign terms in exchange for foreign funding. This was something entirely different. A sovereign African project that would proceed with or without foreign approval. Monsieur Traoré, said François Dubois, his French carrying the cultural superiority that had justified generations of exploitation. France has centuries of experience in African development. We understand the local conditions, the cultural sensitivities, the political complexities. Surely such understanding has value in a project of this scope. Monsieur Dubois, Kwame replied, his voice carrying the musical cadence of Bambara mixed with the precision of French academic training. France has centuries of experience in African extraction. But this project is about African creation, African innovation, African sovereignty. We are not seeking to extract resources from Africa. We are seeking to add value to African resources for African benefit. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. The foreign delegations had arrived expecting to find another African development project that would follow the established patterns. Foreign funding, foreign expertise, foreign control, with Africans serving as grateful beneficiaries rather than equal partners. Instead, they had found something unprecedented. A fully African-funded, African-designed, African-controlled project that would compete directly with European and American technological leadership. The implications were staggering, and Kwame could see the delegates struggling to process what they were witnessing. Mr. Traoré, said Minister Richter, his voice carrying a note of what might have been desperation, surely you understand that technological development requires international collaboration, global standards, established protocols. No single region can hope to compete with the accumulated expertise of Silicon Valley, the technological infrastructure of Europe, the manufacturing capacity of Asia. Her minister, Kwame replied, his German carrying the precision of someone who had studied in Munich before choosing to return home. I understand that technological development requires vision, determination, and the courage to challenge established assumptions. Silicon Valley was built by immigrants from around the world, many of them African. European technological infrastructure was built with African resources and African labor. Asian manufacturing capacity was developed with African materials and African markets. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle like dust on the evening air. What we are doing here is not unprecedented. It is inevitable. We are simply choosing to develop our own resources, train our own people, and keep our own profits instead of exporting them to foreign shareholders. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to bless the earth below. Around the compound, the sounds of construction continued. The whir of machinery, the voices of workers, the rhythm of progress that would not be slowed by foreign skepticism or colonial assumptions. Gentlemen, Kwame said, his voice carrying the finality of a decision that would not be reversed, you are welcome to invest in our project, to participate in our success, to benefit from our innovations. But you are not welcome to control our vision, direct our development, or compromise our sovereignty. The foreign delegations departed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, their convoy lights fading into the distance like the last remnants of an era that was passing away. Behind them, the construction lights illuminated the future taking shape. Solar panels and wind turbines, fiber optic networks and quantum processors, residential towers and community centers, all rising from African soil according to African dreams. Kwame Wa, said Aminata, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a battle won, I think they finally understand that this is not a negotiation. Aminata Wa, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral wisdom, they understand that the world is changing and Africa is choosing to lead that change rather than follow it. The drums in the distance seemed to grow louder, their rhythm matching the pulse of machinery and the heartbeat of a continent awakening to its own potential. In that sound, Kwame heard the voice of his grandmother, no longer mourning the past but celebrating the future, no longer cursing the darkness but lighting the way forward. The smart city was rising, but it was more than architecture and infrastructure. It was a statement, a declaration, a promise that African children like Fatoumata would grow up in a world where African technological leadership was not a dream but a reality, where African resources served African development, where African voices shaped African futures. The revolution had begun, and it was being built one quantum processor at a time, one solar panel at a time, one dream at a time. The ancestors were watching and they were proud.